So today, as I go through the talk, I'm going to go over a lot about wages and working conditions in sweatshops, and I'm going to have some graphs and figures to show you. But before I get to that, I do want to start by just showing you some pictures to put a human face on it. This here is a view inside a sweatshop. It comes out a little bit blurry when it's blown up to the screen in here, but you can make it out. Of people sitting around, the sewing machines are rather close together. The workers have their shirts off, so I'd deduce that it's probably hot in there. There is a fan, if you notice, up in the back, but if you also notice, you can see the blades of the fan, which means it's not moving. So whether it's working or not, I'm not sure. Obviously a place where not many of us would choose to work, likely for little money and very poor working conditions. However, what we have to keep in mind in these situations is what are the other available alternatives to those workers, not how does it compare with the available alternatives to us in the United States. And often, those alternatives are much, much worse. Subsistence agriculture, working in the fields. This, if you've been to poorer countries, you often see people going into the forest, chopping down trees that are largely unowned communal property, then bringing them to the market to sell as fuel or to use themselves. Or even worse, destitute, begging, starvation. These are all much worse alternatives than working in that sweatshop. So what we have to be careful with is when we look at policies to try to help sweatshop workers, that we don't do something to endanger their jobs that would throw them into one of these even worse alternatives. So I'd like to start by defining what type of sweatshops I'm talking about, because it's a kind of squishy term, people throw it around all the time. The type that I'm going to be talking about are low-wage places in the third world where workers choose to work that have very poor health and safety conditions. The one type that I will not be talking about is situations where workers don't choose to work there. So coerced labor, when they literally force someone to work in the sweatshop with the threat of violence, either from their government or from the employer. That's slave labor. It's not part of what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, admittedly, from a bad set of other choices often, but where the worker themselves still makes the choice to be there. And that choice is important, and that's largely the reason why most economists take a gains from trade perspective when they talk about sweatshops, meaning employers obviously employ the workers because they make a profit from doing so, but workers choose to work there because the worker perceives that's their best available opportunity. And this is economists, from the right like Walter Williams to the far left like Paul Krugman have published on the sweatshops, taking a gains from trade perspective. So with these awful alternatives, this is one instance in Cambodia here, where hundreds of people scavenge it for plastic bags, metal cans, and bits of food and trash dumps. And then they talk about one worker or one person who was scavenging there, and said they were averaging 75 cents a day for her efforts. For her, the idea of working, of being exploited in a garment factory, working only 6 days a week inside, instead of 7 days a week outside in the broiling sun for up to $2 a day, is a dream. Now, of course, we want to do things that will try to make this dream better, but we want to make darn sure that we're not throwing her out of $2 a day and back to 75 cents a day working. And the first time I read this, the economist in me just went right to that $2 versus 75 cent comparison. But there's something else as I've done more work on sweatshops that has stuck out to me more and more. And that's in the middle of the quote, the broiling sun. There's a status about moving from out in the fields and agriculture to moving indoors and working inside. The first time that this was really impressed upon me was when I was down in Guatemala one time. I've been down a few times. And I often try to combine hiking with my trips when I go different places. And I was out hiking some volcanoes outside, about an hour outside of Antigua, maybe an hour and a half from Antigua. And as I was coming off the volcano that time, I had a guide with me. Mostly, I didn't really need one for the hike, but the price of labor was really cheap and it included transportation and food and tents, so I didn't have to pack all of that stuff. So he was with me and we're coming down and there's a man out in the fields working. And he was essentially doing the work of what a farm animal would do, an ox. He had a cross piece on his shoulder, and he had 2 large logs that were propped up on it and were being dragged behind him that he was pulling down the mountain to bring to the bottom to have it chopped up for fuel. And so I asked the guide, how much does he make for doing that? And he quoted me in quetzales. I think it was around 50 quetzales or something like that. Basically, when you translate it back, it roughly worked out to about a beer and a half. That's how I do foreign currency conversions, by the way. Whenever I'm in a foreign country, I do the exchange rate, figure out what a beer costs, and then evaluate everything else in terms of, oh, that's 5 beers, that's 10 beers, that's how I do my relative prices. Which also leads to me not bringing home very many souvenirs because I'm always thinking of the beers I could have had. Anyway, it's about a beer and a half a day that I'd earned doing this. And so then I asked him, I said, well, what does somebody earn working in the garment factory? He says, oh, well, it varies. I said, well, not in the capital, somewhere out, outside of the capital, entry-level worker, basic bottom type earner. Oh, well, he didn't really want to give me an answer. Eventually, he gave me an answer that was about 2 to 3 times what the guy in the fields was earning. But before I could follow up with anything, he said, as soon as he quoted me the wage, he said, but that's inside, not outside. Like there was a difference to this, both in terms of quality of life and how other people would perceive them down there. And this is coming from a guy who works as a hiking guide, so he's obviously not adverse to the outdoors. And this was a picture I took as I was coming off. I didn't take one of that man, but it's kind of hard to tell from here, but they're actually young children who are hauling the wood that was later chopped up. This next picture is a little bit better. It was a different trip, actually, when I was down, but same region generally. And this was a Thursday, I think, that I was out hiking on this one. Coming down, and 2 children, it's a little hard to tell, but I'm going to guess 8 to 11 years old or so out there working. And oftentimes when people are talking about sweatshops, they'll say, well, just it's the kids. We just got to get the kids out of there. Well, it's often not the case that getting the kids out of there results in the kids then going to some middle-class education like you'd have in the United States. The children are working not because their parents are mean, but because their families are desperately poor and need whatever meager earnings that they can get. As you look in countries have economic growth, as you get to middle-income countries, child labor virtually disappears by itself. But until then, they need those wages or what they can earn. So when we do things like boycott a factory that was using child labor, it might result in those children not having that job anymore, but it doesn't result in them just going to school quite often. These kids here are out working on the farm during a day that would be a school day, probably earning much less than what they could if they were in a factory, and probably not building as many skills as what they'd build if they were working in a factory for the future. They're essentially training to grow up and be like the man I saw who was essentially functioning as an ox. So we have to make sure that we don't throw them into these worse situations. Sometimes it's much worse. So Bangladesh, a factory was pressured into firing its child employees by protest in the United States. Oxfam, the British charity, reported on this, that afterwards, quote, thousands of the children became prostitutes or starved. Clearly, prostitution and starvation are worse alternatives. So with these in mind, we need to think about what determines the level of compensation and the mix of compensation of workers to make sure any policies advocated don't risk throwing them into these worse alternatives. So first, level of compensation. So the maximum an employer is willing to pay an employee, pretty simple. How much do they contribute to my revenue? So in economics speak, marginal revenue product. In normal people speak, how much value per hour can that employee provide me? That's the maximum I'd be willing to pay. Now, of course, employers aren't charities. They don't want to pay that much. Ideally, they'd like, if you create $4 an hour, they'd like to pay you $0 an hour and get $4 an hour worth of profits from you. So that's just the upper bound. The lower bound, what's the lowest that they can offer you and you'd still take the job? So in econ speak again, it's what's the worker's opportunity cost? So they have to make an offer that's more attractive to that employee than what they could get elsewhere. Between those 2 bounds is where wages can fall. In practice, this upper and lower bound tend to be very close together because the amount of revenue that you can create at one place is often closely related to the amount of revenue you could create for somebody else, which is telling you what your bargaining range is going to be here, especially when we're talking low-skilled workers. These bounds tend to be fairly tight together. Looking at cross-country study on this, they figure it's about 75% of employee wages can be, the variation of employee wages can be explained by differences in worker productivity. So that's the upper bound stuff. So maybe 25% comes from variation in lower bound. This means if we advocate policies, we have to make sure that they don't risk raising the employee compensation above that upper bound. In fact, fundamentally, what we need to do is advocate policies that do something to raise that upper bound and also raise that lower bound as well. Any reforms that we try to do that don't fundamentally address that risk raising employee wages above their productivity. If you raise their wages above the productivity, any profit-maximizing employer is not going to hire them anymore, or they will fire them if they are already employed. So that's the constraint that you have to operate in. Now, a lot of people respect that constraint, but they'll say it's not the wages, it's the working conditions. So I was actually debating a woman from the National Labor Committee about a year ago at a university, and in her opening statement, she said, I'm not going to debate about wages. I admit that wages in sweatshops are going to be better than most other places. Instead, I want to talk about working conditions, which I was shocked, actually, that she did that, and so was the student group that sponsored her to bring her in there to debate me. But she wanted to separate and say, I just want to talk about health and safety conditions. Well, the two are intimately related. So employers don't care how they pay you. They care about your total level of compensation. Whether they give it to you in dollars or give it to you in other benefits, it's still just money out of their pocket. That's what they care about, is that total amount that they have to pay you, not how it's divided up between monetary wages, extra health, extra safety at the factory, bathroom breaks, lunch breaks, more predictable working hours, all of these other things that they could give an employee that an employee would value, but would cost the employer in terms of the profits that they could make. Employer doesn't care how he splits it up. Either way, cost is a cost. He cares about the total size of the package. Who does care about the mix? The employee cares about the mix. Most of you who have part-time jobs probably wouldn't be too happy if someone cut your wages in half, but then all of a sudden gave you a lot more perks on the job. Employees do care about it. And that means an employer has every incentive to try to tailor the compensation, the mix, towards employee preferences. If they don't, they're leaving money on the table, basically to get any given level of worker satisfaction. If you do it with a package that's not their optimal mix, the whole size of the package costs you more than what you would do if you remixed it to give them the desired trade-offs between the two for the employees. So when we see the mix of compensation, that's largely driven by employee preferences. Obviously not each individual employee, but your employees on average. Now, we find these health and safety conditions, they're appalling compared to our standards. The reason they're so bad is because worker productivity, that upper bound, total compensation, is so low. When total compensation is very small, workers tend to choose almost all of their compensation in terms of wages rather than health and safety. This makes sense if, health, leisure, child leisure, safety are all normal goods, meaning as your income goes up, you'll purchase more of them. Well, when you're desperately poor, you're going to purchase less of it. They take most of their wages, or most of their compensation, in the form of wages because they're trying to desperately to feed, clothe, and shelter their families. So advocating policies that change the mix of compensation, really what an activist is doing is saying, my preferences are best. I know what's best for you better than what you, the workers, do. They always pitch it as saying, it's the evil employer who's not giving you health and safety. I'm going to make him give you health and safety. But really, it's the mix that's being chosen by the employees. And now someone in the West saying, I actually have a better idea than what you, the worker who's in that condition, knows for yourself. So if you advocate policies that change the mix, one of two things is going to happen. Either that bundle is going to change away from what the employee preferred, or you're going to end up inflating the overall total cost of compensation higher, and as a result, maybe go above their upper bound, and if that's the case, unemployed workers throwing them into these worse alternatives. Now, some people will say these companies make exorbitant profits. Can't we just make them give up some of their profits to do this? This ignores basic economic thinking of thinking on the margin. The companies may make a profit from doing this, but they're not charities, they're profit maximizers. If you do something to change the type of compensation they have to give their employees, their profit maximizing quantity to employ will change. That means they might not shut down the whole factory, sometimes they might. Sometimes they might shut it down in one place, move it to a different country. But other times they'll just lay off some workers on the margin. So even if they're making profits, you can't just say, take some money out of their profits and give it to the employees without having the company respond and make a change into how many employees they're willing to hire. You change their marginal opportunity cost of hiring workers, they'll hire fewer of them. So just simply having profits there isn't enough in order to be able to dip into it. Now, the anti-sweatshop movement's a curious mix of people. I don't know actually if Metro State has students against sweatshop labor on campus. Do we? I imagine some would be in the room. Maybe not. So it's a mix. You have celebrities, you have student activists, politicians, academics, labor unions. Some of the major players here, Unite is a garment workers union, National Labor Committee, and I put United Students Against Sweatshops just because we're on campus. There maybe would be some of you here. Now, it's no accident that you find labor unions who are advocating policies to help third world workers, or excuse me, advocating policies in the name of helping third world workers. It's because the unions understand the economics behind this. Now, a union, if it's doing its job, what's it supposed to do? It's supposed to raise the wages and compensation of its members. That's what a union's supposed to do. Well, these third world workers aren't members of the US labor union, so why are they running around advocating policies for someone who's not a member? Answer's easy. Third world labor is a substitute for first world labor, not a one-to-one substitute, but it is a substitute. If they do things that raise the level of compensation for third world workers above their marginal productivity, they're going to unemploy third world workers and as a result have greater demand for more skilled US workers. And as a result be able to push up their employment and wage levels here. So what they do when they advocate things in the name of helping workers, it's really policies that would make those workers worse off, but would help their already, by world standards, wealthy union members here in the United States. Now the things that they call for: international labor standards, so health and safety conditions that must be respected everywhere. Minimum or living wages. The right to organize, and I put right in quotations because by that they don't mean the right for some people to get together and bargain as a group. What they mean is the right for some group of people to get together and decide that for other people who aren't part of that group, they're going to get to bargain for everybody. So it's forced association, not just the freedom to associate freely. But probably the worst thing of all, what's the worst thing that you could advocate for if you want to help sweatshop workers? And it's a common one. What? Closing them or boycotting them, right? Boycott, this one here is the Gap, Old Navy. It also has Save the Redwoods on here, so I don't know, it must have been for UC Santa Cruz or something. Also common, boycott Nike. They use sweatshop labor. Well, what's a boycott do? Instantly, it lowers the demand for the product. Well, let's think about that upper and lower bound now for the workers. That upper bound is limited by how much revenue they can create for the company. If we have a boycott that decreases the demand for a company's goods, the final sales price in the US goes down. As a result, that worker who was stitching sneakers before, nothing physical has changed about them. They stitch just as fast as they could before, make just as much same physical product. But now, that physical product is worth less. As a result, with nothing changing about that worker, their upper bound just came down through no fault of their own. Other thing that it does is it might just make it undesirable to employ them at all, to close the factory then. So boycotts are probably the worst way you could go about helping the workers. Some economists, I'm ashamed to say, are in on this as well. There was Scholars Against Sweatshop Labor that circulated a letter. I put in there where most of the signers were from was kind of the usual suspects: UMass and Notre Dame and New School, kind of the three last bastions of Marxian economics in the country. But they circulated a letter in support of anti-sweatshop movement to counter a letter that Jagdish Bhagwati and the International Trade Economist had circulated. The International Trade Economist basically sent a letter around to university presidents saying, stop banning sweatshop products from your university stores, you're hurting the workers. And in it, they said it's well known that multinational firms usually pay higher wages than domestic firms in the countries that they operate in. Well, this Scholars Against Sweatshop Labor, they responded and they said it may well be true that multinationals generally pay higher wages, but that doesn't speak to the situation of sweatshops. Because where these sweatshops, most of the garments are produced throughout the world, is firms subcontracted by the multinationals, not the multinationals themselves. So when you hear about Walmart and sweatshops, it's never Walmart itself that's employing them. It's almost always domestic subcontractors, local firms who then sell the products to Walmart or to another firm. So the economists who circulated this were right about that. No one had done the work. So actually that's what got myself and a student of mine at the time who was an undergrad, David Scarbeck, interested in working on this project. So we put together a list of sweatshop using countries. Now, to do this research, we had to come up with a definition of what is a sweatshop without opening ourselves up to, well, you've just picked the cases that would make your case easiest. So, but there's no real good hard definition of what a sweatshop is. So what we did was we scoured the US news sources from 1995, 96-ish, up till 2003 or 4 when we started working on the paper. And we used LexisNexis to search through all major US news sources and looked for any cases where protesters said something was a sweatshop. We took them at their word that that in fact was a sweatshop then. And we put together a list of the countries that they operated in. So first stage was getting apparel industry wage data from these countries. And if you look here, the wages by US standards are very low. So 13 cents is the low in Bangladesh. The highest in here, I think, was Costa Rica at $2.38 an hour on average. In general, what you see is Asian countries being lower, Latin American countries being a little bit higher. Very low wages by our standards. But that's not the relevant comparison. The relative comparison is what's it like compared to the other jobs in countries. So here, we take those average wages and estimate for various hours of work weeks, 40, 50, 60, 70-hour work weeks. In general, one of the characteristics of a sweatshop is very long work hours. In fact, of the sweatshops we found reported in the paper, in only one instance was the hours worked less than 70 hours a week, and it was in the 60s. I really just have the 40 up there for a comparison to a 40-hour work week here in the United States. So we multiply those hourly wages out and we compare it to average national income in these countries. So the lines don't come through here really well, but you can see where 100% is. If you drew a straight line across, oops, got to be careful here. Not very good health and safety conditions for me. Draw a line straight across at 100%. Every time that these lines go up above 100%, people working in the apparel industry in these countries are earning more than the average national income. 200%, they're earning twice the average national income. In some of these cases, we're up to 4 times average national income. Nicaragua and Honduras, you're up to close to 7 times national income. So like thinking about that in context of the United States, average national income in the United States is ballpark around $40,000 right now. 7 times that. This would be like protesting a job that was $280,000 in the United States and say that that's a job that's bad for the worker compared to their alternatives. Obviously, the absolute standards are much worse in these places, but the question is, if they didn't have these jobs, where would they be? And the averages in their countries are much, much worse than working in the apparel industry. In fact, it's the workers who don't work in the garment industry, the export industry, that we really have to be worried about. They're at much lower standards of living. So we can also compare it to absolute poverty standards in these countries. So this is from the World Bank on people earning less than $1 or $2 a day. And you see significant fractions of the population in most of these countries are less than $2 a day, and even a good number are less than $1 a day. Whereas working in these sweatshops gets you above that standard in most of these places. So in 9 out of the 10 countries, working 10-hour days in the apparel industry lift workers above the $2 a day threshold. The one place it's not true is Bangladesh, but there, 1/3 of the population doesn't make it over the $1 a day threshold, and fewer than 20% make it above the $2 a day threshold. So next step was next stage, let's look at not the apparel industry generally in countries accused of using sweatshops, but let's look at the actual sweatshops themselves. So these are groups that have been protested by anti-sweatshop groups and unions in the United States. The wage data that we have for them now, we don't have comprehensive, there's no such thing as like a database of sweatshop wages. So we had to construct one. So the way we constructed it is, we took the wages that the protesters quoted as sweatshops paying and used that to make our calculations. So the data often comes from the mouth of those people who are protesting sweatshops as bad. Now that means there could be a bias in the data, but if there's that bias, it would be in the direction of understating their earnings if they're trying to say these sweatshops are bad places. If anything, you'd want to find the very newest worker there who earns the very least and try to make them like the average case in the place. Or you might even be, tweaking the numbers to your advantage. Either way, though, what I'm trying to say is that these jobs are better than average. So to the extent that there's a bias in the data, it's going to cut against what I'm trying to say and make it what I have to say harder. Of course, there is another problem that means conversion rates were done all different ways. There's simply no way to control for that. It's the best we can do. So this here is the face of some sweatshop employers that we found when we were reading these different cases. So we've got the Olsen twins back when they were cute, Walmart, and I thought that this was P. Diddy, but last time I gave this talk, someone said it wasn't. Okay, so 50 Cent apparently pays his workers more than 50 cents. But it was supposed to be P. Diddy. So here is the list that we put together. We give you the country, the year, when it was associated with a company in the United States, we report that. And then the hours that they put in here, 18 cents, 8 cents an hour. Sometimes it's per hour, sometimes it's per day, sometimes it's per week, depending on the individual case that we had. Had a number of episodes in China, few in Bangladesh. So, there's P. Diddy. He's up near the top there. Haiti, Honduras. Honduras with Kathy Lee, that's the famous episode in 1986 when she was confronted on television with Wendy Diaz was the worker's name, who was earning 31 cents an hour in Kathy Lee Gifford's sweatshop, making a line of clothes for her, and Kathy Lee explodes into tears on television and apologizes. So I've got a book grant out right now to do a new book on sweatshops, and I have a chapter in the proposal called Don't Cry for Me, Kathy Lee. Because if you do the math on it, that 10-hour days in that sweatshop, they're earning $3.10 a day, which is much more than most of the people in that country earn. And this is someone who is still a young worker too, so could be earning more in the future. So we have a number of cases from Honduras, a ton in India, most of which involve Nike. I'll come back to the Nike point in a second. Nicaragua, Vietnam. So we're going to do the same exercise that we did for the apparel industry, compare it to average incomes in these countries. Without going into too much detail, basically we just have to weight it since they're all from different years so that we're comparing apples to apples. So if we've got 3 cases of sweatshops in a country, one in 96, one in 97, another in 97. We'll average those three wages together, but then we have to compare it to the average income in the country at that time, which would be average income 96, average income 97, average income 97 divided by 3. So that way they were comparing apples to apples. What we find, basically the same thing that we did with the apparel industry, just not quite as dramatic. So now you've got a 50% line, 100% line's a little higher. In most of these places, with the exception of China and El Salvador, working the long hours in the sweatshop brings you up above average national income in the country. And I should caution, by the way, of course, it doesn't have to be better than average national income to be a good job for that worker. Almost by definition, half of your jobs in the country are going to be less than average. The key is it the best job for that individual worker? Then it's better than their next best alternative. But that said, when we're finding jobs that are multiples of national income greater, it's telling you not only is it the best job for that worker, it's probably the best job for a whole lot of people who would like to work there in that country. So China that falls short of the 100% line, I've got one suspicion on that. So I told you at the beginning we're doing non-coercive sweatshops. So in China, a couple of the cases that we found reported, it seemed like coercion was being used on the workers to make them work there. Those cases are not included in our study. But for some other examples in China, it wasn't clear. It was a gray area, so they stayed in the study. So if that's the case, that could be what's biasing those down a little bit. Indonesia, that's lower. Not all of, 7 out of the 9 examples from Indonesia were Nike. But in one of the reports on Nike we read, the workers also, in addition to their regular compensation there, also receive free meals at lunchtime. Well, we don't have a way to value free meals at lunchtime, but if we added that into 7 out of our 9 cases in Indonesia, that would likely pop that line up again. But all the same, general result that we're seeing here, most of them are higher than average national income. A few of them, 4 of them are higher than double national income, and a few of them are close to 3 to 4 times average national income. I should say, by the way, Cambodia, the reason it's just a big black line is because we just had weekly earnings there, so we didn't have to do different hourly estimates. We just had their weeks, so multiplied by 52. So compare it to absolute poverty standards. Again, this is the same table as before. Out of the 45 reported sweatshop cases, 43 result $1 per day, and over half brought the workers, over half, including the Kathy Lee Gifford one, brought the workers up over $2 per day. So while the U.S. likes to write cartoons like this where you have your small-brained employer talking to a sweatshop employee saying, look on the bright side, no one will ever mug you for your paycheck, it's precisely wrong. If you're going to mug someone in one of these countries for their paycheck, it would be someone who works in a sweatshop, not someone who's out in the fields. So this brings us to a question of, is there anything activists can do on the margin that might help? And I say this one only slightly tongue-in-cheek, air sweatshops. So this, somebody thought they were being cute by having Nike, they'll put your name or your initials in their shoe. They had sweatshop put in there. You're obviously limited with the number of letters you can have. They probably didn't know it was going to make it into my talk. Why air sweatshop? Well, let's think about it for a second. Michael Jordan earns millions of dollars from Nike for using his name for Air Jordans. Why does he get paid? It's not because Nike's a charity. Why do they pay Michael Jordan? Because people buy his products because you want to be like Mike, right? That creates subjective value in people's minds. So it shifts out the demand curve for Nikes. As a result, Nike can be more profitable. For that service, they pay Michael Jordan. Now, this is the exact opposite of what I talked about when I said a boycott. A boycott, you're saying, I don't want to buy the product specifically because it's made by a worker who's paid low wages. That's shifting that demand curve in for the product and lowering their upper bound. So if you want to do things that could encourage the employer to pay the employees more, one thing would be being willing to pay more for a product specifically because it came from a sweatshop, maybe one that's certified by one of the groups that goes around. So what is a role for an activist here? It could be certification. So companies who want to say that they pay above normal wages to their workers. Well, you could have student activist groups or activist groups generally who go around and certify that actually whatever the company is saying they actually do, and could give you a seal of approval on it, kind of like Good Housekeeping seal of approval. It'd basically be a certifier for when companies are employing this, what they call ethical branding strategy. So if air sweatshops and knowing that that worker earns, say, $4 a day instead of $2 a day, creates value in the minds of consumers, then what just happened to that employee's upper bound? Instantly, with no improvement in stitching skills, that upper bound just shifted out. They just created a greater marginal revenue product with the same amount of effort. Now, the key is, of course, that this does create subjective value in people's minds. So to some extent, as companies are playing around with ethical branding strategies, you're getting some evidence that in certain cases that it does work. I certainly don't think it's the case for the vast majority of people. vast majority of people want the better product at the lower price without much regard for who was paid how much in making it. So I think it's a niche, something that can be done on the margin to help a few workers, but not something where you can all of a sudden pass a law or a policy and say, this has to be done universally now, because what you're going to find is, well, it might create value for a few people. For the vast majority of the people, it will look like just a higher price to them, and as a result, they're going to have a smaller quantity demanded of the product. You throw workers into worse alternatives. So it's a niche, something that might be useful on the margin, but you've got to be fairly modest about it. And what's cool about it is, it's not just something that makes the company more profitable, it's something that makes the company more profitable specifically tied to that worker. So that's why you can't just pull money out of their profit and give it to them, but if you can do something about changing that worker so that that specific worker is what's creating the profits, then they can get a share of it without having unemployment effects. Oh, the other caveat, by the way, though, is for those of you who do feel this way and want to buy the products like this, also have to keep quantity purchase constant. So if you're like, yeah, I'll buy the more expensive product that I know the labor gets paid a little bit more, but as a result, I'm going to buy fewer things. So maybe you're someone who does like fair trade coffee or something, and like, oh, well, that coffee costs more, so instead of 4 cups a day, I'll drink 2 cups a day. Probably on net, not helping workers. You're going to help some workers who were the ones who produced that, but because you're demanding a smaller quantity, there's going to be fewer overall workers employed in that area, which means some of them are being thrown into those worse alternatives. So even as a branding strategy or whatever, you have to keep quantity purchase constant. If you cut back on quantity, then you're not necessarily helping workers. So process of development view on this. So we want sweatshops to get better, but wishing doesn't make it so, legislating doesn't make it so. Sweatshops are not new. We had them in the United States, we had them in Great Britain. They disappear as worker productivity increases and incomes increase. So what increases that upper bound? Technology, capital, human capital improvements. All of these things are things that raise the upper bound, but they're not like magic pills. You can't just give it to a place. It's a process that takes time. Now, it is true, though, that that process can go much faster now than it used to. In the United States, and for that matter, Great Britain, Germany, the sweatshop stage of development is a roughly 100, 120-year process. But look at how it's happened more recently. Think of just 1950. If products said made in Hong Kong, made in Taiwan, made in South Korea, people would snicker. It's like, oh, it's the junk, the trinkets. Those were sweatshop countries then. But in a period of a generation and a half, instead of the whole time that it took the United States, they grew much more rapidly and were able to outgrow sweatshops and are now upper income countries. So it is a process that does take time, but it can happen much faster now than it did in the past. In fact, look at what's going on in China and India today. That's even more fantastic growth rates. And the main key of this is because the capital and the technology doesn't have to be created anew. Instead, it can be imported. So when companies come, multinational companies come and invest in your country, they bring with them technology and capital, things that help foster this process of economic growth. So sweatshops themselves are part of this process. The other things, leisure, comfort, safety, child leisure, these are all likely normal goods. As this process of growth goes, those things will be improved as well. As that overall upper bound keeps increasing, it takes care of most of these other concerns. But unfortunately, policies that risk raising the level of compensation above worker productivity cut the whole process short. If then the sweatshop bails and doesn't come to your country, now you're not importing technology, you're not importing capital. That's slowing down your process of growth and leaving you stagnating and poor for even longer. So to wrap up here and then take some questions, bottom line here, apparel industry wages and even the very worst sweatshops in the eyes of the protesters are better than worker alternatives in these countries, sometimes significantly better. And after all, there's a reason the workers chose to work there. They perceived it as their best available alternative. Wages are low and working conditions are poor because productivity is. Best cure for this is process of economic development. And I should say, other reasons that productivity is poor that has nothing to do with the fault of the worker is the governments in these countries have horrible policies. So things that make that limit labor productivity in these countries or limit the expected revenue product of hiring labor in these countries. So tariffs and barriers to trade, unstable monetary policy, unsecure property rights, poor rule of law, all of these things in the country mean when a factory invests there, they have to take account of the risk of some of these other things going wrong for them when they go to export and make a profit. As a result, what they can expect to get from any physical product of a worker is less. With better policies in these countries, those upper bounds could increase. Unfortunately, it's institutional reform really that these poor countries need, things that would bring in more sweatshops and would raise the upper bounds. Unfortunately, I don't think there's very much you can do from the outside to create institutional reform in a country that needs stronger property rights, stronger rule of law, and economic freedom. On the margin, there's maybe a few things you can do, but for the most part, it has to come from the people there themselves. And that might come with the process of economic development as they get more sweatshops in. So in the short run, these jobs are better than what else is available to them. In the long run, sweatshops cure themselves. It's part of the process of economic development. So until then, I love sweatshops, and so should you.